September 1950. Kim Il-sung watches his North Korean army, which nearly conquered all of Korea just weeks ago, collapse in complete disarray after MacArthur's Inchon landing. His capital, Seoul, is lost. His forces are being destroyed, and now MacArthur is crossing the 38th parallel, driving north to finish what Inchon started. Kim Il-sung, the leader who started this war believing he could unify Korea quickly before America could intervene effectively, now faces total defeat. What he says in this moment of crisis reveals a man who understands his gamble has failed catastrophically, but who also recognizes that MacArthur's pursuit into North Korea will trigger Chinese intervention that will save his regime. Kim is not panicking. He is calculating. The point of no return is not his defeat. It is the moment when MacArthur's confidence turns American victory into catastrophe that will rescue North Korea from destruction. Subscribe for more MacArthur stories and help us reach 500 subscribers. Kim Il-sung's decision to invade South Korea in June 1950 was calculated gamble based on assumptions that proved partially correct and partially catastrophically wrong. He was correct that South Korean forces were weak and poorly organized, unable to resist determined North Korean assault. He was correct that the Soviet Union would provide weapons and support for the invasion. He was correct that many Koreans, exhausted by years of division and occupation, might support unification even under communist rule. But he was catastrophically wrong in his assumption that America would not intervene effectively before North Korea could consolidate control of the entire peninsula. The rapid American response, the commitment of ground forces, and particularly MacArthur's Inchon landing, transformed what appeared to be certain victory into sudden disaster. What Kim says to his Soviet and Chinese advisors during the collapse of September 1950 reveals man struggling to understand how his careful planning produced catastrophe. He had been told by Soviet intelligence that America would not commit major forces to defend South Korea, that American public opinion would not support another Asian war, and that any American intervention would be too slow to prevent North Korean victory. The initial success of the invasion seemed to confirm these assessments. Within weeks, North Korean forces had captured Seoul and pushed South Korean and American forces into small perimeter around Busan. Victory appeared certain. Kim was already planning how to govern unified Korea when MacArthur's Inchon landing destroyed his entire strategic position overnight. The military collapse is so rapid and complete that Kim barely escapes capture. The Inchon landing cuts North Korean supply lines to forces fighting in the south. Those forces, already strained by months of combat, begin to disintegrate. Some units retreat in good order. Others simply dissolve, with soldiers abandoning equipment and fleeing north to avoid being cut off and captured. Seoul is retaken by United Nations forces. The front lines that took months to establish collapse in days. Kim watches his army, which seemed invincible in July, become a rabble fleeing north in disorder. The psychological shock is as devastating as the tactical defeat. Everything Kim believed about the war has proven wrong. What distinguishes Kim's reaction from pure panic is his understanding of the larger strategic picture. He knows that Soviet Union will not allow complete destruction of North Korea without attempting some response, because Soviet prestige is invested in the success of communist expansion in Korea. More importantly, Kim understands that China cannot tolerate American forces on its border, and will intervene if MacArthur pushes too far north. Kim's immediate military position is desperate, but he recognizes that MacArthur's pursuit into North Korea creates conditions where Chinese intervention becomes likely. If China intervenes with the massive forces Kim knows China is capable of mobilizing, North Korea can survive despite the current military disaster. The critical question Kim faces in September and October 1950 is whether his regime can survive long enough for Chinese intervention to occur. North Korean forces are retreating but not completely destroyed. If Kim can maintain some organized military resistance and can keep MacArthur's forces from capturing all of North Korea within weeks, China will have time to make decision about intervention and to move forces into position. What Kim says to his remaining commanders is that their job is not to win battles, but to delay American advance long enough for Chinese help to arrive. Every day that North Korean forces remain in the field, every town that requires American forces to fight rather than simply occupy, increases the chance that China will intervene before North Korea is completely overrun. Kim is no longer fighting to win the war. He is fighting to survive until the strategic situation changes. From Kim Il-sung's perspective as North Korean leader facing imminent defeat, MacArthur's decision to cross the 38th parallel and drive toward the Yalu River is simultaneously devastating and potentially saving. Devastating because it means American forces will occupy North Korean territory, capture the capital Pyongyang, and potentially destroy the North Korean government entirely. But potentially saving because Kim knows this advance will provoke Chinese intervention that will rescue North Korea from complete destruction. Kim has been receiving messages from Chinese leadership indicating that China is watching the situation carefully and will not allow American forces to occupy all of Korea. MacArthur's confident advance north is exactly what will trigger Chinese response. What Kim says to Stalin during this period reveals his desperation, but also his strategic calculation. Through diplomatic channels, Kim pleads with Stalin to provide direct Soviet military support to save North Korea. Soviet pilots are already flying combat missions disguised as North Korean or Chinese pilots, but Kim wants open Soviet intervention with ground forces. Stalin refuses, not wanting to risk direct Soviet-American conflict. But Stalin also indicates that China is preparing to intervene and that Kim should focus on maintaining resistance long enough for Chinese forces to arrive. Kim understands that Stalin is using North Korea as buffer and that Soviet Union will sacrifice North Korean regime rather than risk war with America. Chinese intervention is Kim's only realistic hope for survival. The communications between Kim and Chinese leadership during October 1950 show Kim simultaneously pleading for help and trying to appear confident that North Korean forces can hold out. Kim tells Chinese leaders that North Korean resistance is stronger than it appears, and that American forces are overextended and vulnerable. He emphasizes that Chinese intervention now, while American forces are advancing rapidly and carelessly, offers better odds of success than waiting until America consolidates control. Kim is essentially making same argument to China that Zhou Enlai is making to Mao. Fight now when conditions favor intervention, rather than waiting until the situation is hopeless. Kim's survival depends on convincing China to act quickly. What makes Kim's position particularly precarious is that he has limited leverage over Chinese decision-making. China will intervene based on Chinese security interests, not out of solidarity with North Korean communism or personal loyalty to Kim. If Chinese leaders decide that intervention is too risky or that North Korea is not worth saving, Kim and his regime will be destroyed regardless of his appeals for help. Kim must watch MacArthur's advance and hope that it continues far enough and fast enough to alarm Chinese leadership into action, while also hoping that North Korean forces can maintain enough resistance to give China time to intervene before North Korea is completely occupied. The moment Kim recognizes as the point of no return comes in mid-October when MacArthur's forces cross the 38th parallel and drive rapidly north. Kim understands that this advance makes Chinese intervention inevitable. China has warned repeatedly that it cannot tolerate American forces on its border, and MacArthur is calling that bluff. From Kim's perspective, MacArthur is making the fatal mistake that will save North Korea. If MacArthur had stopped at the 38th parallel and consolidated control of South Korea, Chinese intervention would have been unlikely, and Kim's regime would have been destroyed from safe distance by American air power and South Korean forces. But by pushing north toward the Yalu River, MacArthur is creating the crisis that will bring Chinese forces into the war and will rescue Kim from imminent defeat. What Kim says when he learns of MacArthur's advance is relief mixed with grim satisfaction that American generals' confidence will prove to be North Korea's salvation. If you're seeing how MacArthur's decisions had consequences he never anticipated, subscribe to help us reach 500 subscribers. The period from mid-October to late November 1950 is most desperate time in Kim Il-sung's life. His regime is on the verge of complete destruction. American forces have captured Pyongyang. North Korean government has fled to temporary capital near Chinese border. What remains of North Korean army is scattered and demoralized. Kim knows that Chinese intervention is his only hope for survival, but he does not know whether or when Chinese forces will actually cross the Yalu River and engage American forces. The uncertainty is agonizing. Every day without Chinese intervention is day closer to complete North Korean collapse. What Kim says to his remaining commanders during this waiting period reveals his understanding that North Korean military role has changed from attempting to win war to simply surviving long enough for Chinese intervention to occur. He orders his forces to avoid decisive battles that would result in total destruction of remaining North Korean units. Instead, they should conduct delaying actions, small-scale ambushes, and harassment operations that slow American advance without risking annihilation. The goal is to maintain enough organized resistance that Americans cannot declare victory and end offensive operations. As long as American forces are still advancing and still encountering resistance, Chinese intervention remains possible. If North Korean forces collapse completely, China might decide intervention is pointless. The first signs that Chinese intervention is actually happening come in late October, when North Korean units begin reporting encounters with soldiers who appear to be Chinese rather than North Korean. Initially, these reports are limited and confusing because Chinese forces are infiltrating secretly and avoiding detection by American reconnaissance. Kim receives information through Chinese advisors that major Chinese forces are crossing the Yalu River and positioning themselves to attack American forces, but he has no way to verify this information or to know the scale of Chinese commitment. The uncertainty about whether China is intervening with token forces or with massive army is torture for Kim. Who knows, his survival depends entirely on Chinese military success. What makes this waiting period particularly difficult for Kim is that he has no control over Chinese strategy or timing. Chinese forces are under Chinese command pursuing Chinese objectives. If Chinese intervention succeeds, North Korea will survive, but Kim's regime will be dependent on Chinese support and will effectively become Chinese client state. If Chinese intervention fails, or if China decides to limit its objectives to protecting the border region rather than rescuing all of North Korea, Kim may survive personally by fleeing to China, but his regime and his country will be destroyed. Kim's fate is entirely in Chinese hands, and all he can do is wait and hope that Chinese calculations favor North Korean survival. The emotional strain on Kim during this period is evident in accounts from people around him. He oscillates between confidence that Chinese intervention will save North Korea and despair that American forces will complete their conquest before Chinese help arrives. He makes plans for government in exile in China, while simultaneously preparing victory proclamations for when Chinese forces push Americans back. He trusts Chinese assurances that major intervention is occurring while simultaneously doubting that China will commit sufficient forces to actually change the war. What Kim says privately reveals man who started war confident of easy victory and now finds himself completely dependent on forces beyond his control to avoid complete defeat. The gambler who thought he understood the odds has learned that he gambled with stakes he could not afford to lose. When Chinese forces launched massive attack on November 25, 1950, catching MacArthur's forces completely by surprise and forcing them into desperate retreat, Kim Il-sung's relief and satisfaction are profound. The intervention he hoped for has materialized on scale that exceeds his expectations. Chinese forces numbering in hundreds of thousands attack across entire front, overwhelming American and United Nations forces that are completely unprepared for battle of this magnitude. Within days, the confident American advance that threatened to destroy Kim's regime completely has been reversed into chaotic retreat. North Korea has been saved from destruction by Chinese intervention that MacArthur's advance provoked. What Kim says when he receives reports of Chinese attack reveals his understanding that this rescue comes at price of North Korean independence. His country has been saved but is now dependent on Chinese military power and Chinese strategic decisions. Chinese forces operating in North Korea are under Chinese command pursuing Chinese objectives. Kim's remaining North Korean forces are subordinate to Chinese leadership. Decisions about military strategy, about whether to pursue retreating American forces, about what political settlement might end the war, all of these will be made in Beijing rather than by Kim. The sovereignty Kim claimed when he invaded South Korea has been sacrificed to survive the consequences of that invasion's failure. The immediate priority for Kim after Chinese intervention is rebuilding North Korean state and military from the ruins of the defeat MacArthur inflicted. Chinese forces are doing the fighting, but Kim needs to reconstruct government institutions, restore economic production, and reorganize military forces if North Korea is to survive as viable state after the war ends. This reconstruction is complicated by the fact that much of North Korean territory is still occupied by American forces, and by the fact that American air power continues to devastate North Korean infrastructure, even as Chinese ground forces push American troops back. Kim must rebuild under conditions of ongoing war and under Chinese supervision that limits his autonomy. What makes Kim's position after Chinese intervention particularly complicated is managing relationship with China while maintaining some degree of North Korean independence. Chinese leaders expect gratitude and deference for having saved North Korea from destruction. Stalin, watching from Moscow, expects Kim to remain loyal to Soviet Union despite increasing Chinese influence in North Korea. Kim must navigate between Chinese and Soviet expectations while trying to preserve space for North Korean agency. This balancing act will characterize Kim's leadership for the rest of his life and will shape North Korean foreign policy for decades. The rescue that saved Kim's regime also constrained it permanently. Kim's assessment of MacArthur's role in North Korean survival is complex and cynical. MacArthur's Inchon landing nearly destroyed North Korea and exposed all of Kim's strategic miscalculations. But MacArthur's decision to pursue across the 38th parallel and advance toward the Yalu River triggered Chinese intervention that saved North Korea. If MacArthur had been more cautious, if he had stopped at the 38th parallel and consolidated control of South Korea, Kim's regime would have been destroyed gradually without triggering Chinese response. MacArthur's confidence and his dismissal of Chinese warnings created the exact conditions that made Chinese intervention both necessary and successful. What Kim says about MacArthur combines hatred for the man who nearly destroyed his country with perverse gratitude that MacArthur's arrogance provoked the Chinese response that rescued North Korea from complete destruction. What Kim Il-sung said when MacArthur crossed the point of no return was that North Korea's survival depended entirely on Chinese intervention, and that MacArthur's confident advance toward the Yalu River was creating the conditions that would make that intervention inevitable. Kim's assessment proved correct. Chinese intervention saved North Korea from destruction and created military stalemate that eventually produced armistice preserving North Korean state. But the manner of North Korea's survival had permanent consequences for Kim's regime and for the country he led until his death in 1994. The most significant consequence of being saved by Chinese intervention was permanent dependence on China, and later on both China and Soviet Union for economic and military support. North Korea emerged from the war completely devastated. Its infrastructure was destroyed by American bombing. Its economy was ruined. Its population was traumatized. Rebuilding required massive aid from China and Soviet Union, which both provided support, but which also expected political loyalty and policy alignment in return. Kim spent decades managing these relationships, playing Chinese and Soviet patrons against each other to maintain maximum autonomy while remaining dependent on both. The survival that seemed like salvation in 1950 became permanent constraint on North Korean sovereignty. The psychological impact of nearly being destroyed and then being rescued shaped Kim's paranoia and his determination to build military capability that would prevent North Korea from ever being so vulnerable again. The Juche ideology of self-reliance that Kim promoted was direct response to the experience of depending on Chinese intervention for survival. North Korea's massive military mobilization, its development of nuclear weapons decades later, its fortress mentality and isolation from international community, all trace back to Kim's experience of nearly losing everything and being saved only through foreign intervention. The trauma of 1950 created political culture of siege and militarization that persists in North Korea 70 years later. Kim's personal legacy is inseparable from the war he started and nearly lost. He remained in power for 44 years after the war, eventually passing leadership to his son in first dynastic succession in communist history. North Korean propaganda portrayed Kim as great leader who defended country against American aggression, omitting his responsibility for starting war and for the catastrophic defeats that required Chinese rescue. The mythology Kim constructed about the war became foundation for his personality cult and for the totalitarian system he built. The near destruction he experienced in 1950 taught him that absolute control over society and military was necessary for regime survival, lessons he applied ruthlessly for the rest of his life. What makes Kim's survival significant in Cold War history is what it demonstrated about limitations of American military power. MacArthur's Inchon landing showed American operational brilliance, but MacArthur's subsequent advance to the Yalu River showed American strategic blindness that turned military success into strategic failure. Kim started war recklessly and nearly paid ultimate price for that recklessness. But MacArthur's pursuit into North Korea rescued Kim by triggering Chinese intervention that MacArthur insisted would not occur. The point of no return was not when North Korean forces were defeated. It was when MacArthur's confidence made Chinese intervention inevitable. and that intervention created conditions for North Korean survival despite Kim's catastrophic military failures. Kim's ability to survive his own mistakes, enabled by MacArthur's even greater mistake, created the North Korean state that exists today and that remains central problem in Asian security 7 decades after the war that nearly destroyed it ended in stalemate that preserved it. Subscribe to discover how MacArthur's strategic decisions created lasting consequences across decades.